Hi everyone, my name is Benjamin King. I'm a security consultant at MWR, and today I'd like to show you how a standard employee has the ability to execute large-scale company compromise. So these are attacks we've actively exploited over the past years. So to state plainly, they're not theoretical or isolated or rare events, but reoccurring issues we've encountered. So we've put together a series of demonstrations to give you a tangible understanding of what makes these attacks possible, how they are conducted, and the impact this could have on business. So I know everyone's very familiar with the domain compromise, but I'd like to just touch on it again now for context. So a domain controls the keys and the doors to a company's digital assets. It allows its users to seamlessly use company resources without having to continuously supply their credentials. An attacker will generally target the domain before targeting other systems so they can control or have access to these keys. So you can think about it as a thief who's stolen all the keys to a bank's vaults. Then all he needs to do is get to the vaults and escape with the valuables. In the end, a domain compromise could result in severe financial damage to the company, whether this is as a result of direct monetary transfer or revenue losses as a result of unexpected downtime. A simplified environment was created mimicking what we have seen in the industry. The environment consists of fully patched hosts, so the attacks we're going to demonstrate for you are possible because of misconfigurations and not vulnerabilities. So they can't be fixed on Patch Tuesday. They'll need to be proactively altered and remediated. The attack is simulated from the perspective of an employee who had fallen victim to a phishing campaign. The first attack is conducted by exploiting misconfigurations in Active Directory certificate services. So a misconfigured certificate template is exploited to request a certificate impersonating a domain administrator. So for example, Bob enrolls for a certificate and then requests to be a domain admin. The second attack is an NCLM Relay attack. So this is a practical demonstration of what is possible when SMB signing is not enforced. The SCCM server is coerced to authenticate to the attacker, whereby the credential material is then relayed off to the database server in order to extract credentials from memory. These credentials are then later used to compromise the domain. The ADCS attack is conducted on the workstation itself for simplicity to grasp the concepts. And the NCLM Relay attack is conducted remotely to simulate how an attacker would likely exploit the issue. But both can just as easily be conducted remotely using the workstation as a proxy. Okay. So a short introduction to ADCS. It provides services to create and manage public key infrastructure. These services can be used for encryption or digital signing of documents. So as an example, any TLS encryption such as web applications, database connections, remote desktop connections. But it can also be used for authentication, which is where the problems arise. A common issue we've encountered over the last year is when a certificate template is misconfigured. These misconfigurations, like I said previously, allowed any user to enroll and supply their own username. So then Bob can supply the username of the domain administrator. And again, demonstration is conducted from the employee's workstation. Just for simplicity, to show that it's relatively simple to conduct an attack, that you don't need a high level of sophistication or a sophisticated tool, but can actually be conducted using Microsoft built-in applications. So a certificate impersonating a domain admin user is requested using MMC. So MMC is a graphical tool that can be used to manage Windows services, such as certificate services. An employee can request a certificate from the ADCS server using the certificate snap-in. If you just wait for it. Okay. As you can see, the user can supply their own username. As you can see, the certificate template requires the user to supply additional information. This is also a way to identify if a specific certificate is vulnerable to the attack. So the user can then supply the username of the domain administrator under the user principal attribute. So this attribute gets interpreted as a valid user identifier when using the certificate. So once they've supplied the username and role for the certificate, you can see it's been stored in the user's personal certificate store. And it's really that simple. We've seen misconfigurations exactly like this over the past year. Concerning detection, it's highly unlikely that these attacks will be detected given that it exploits legitimate functionality, unless custom monitoring conditions have been added, in which case it might be easier just to resolve the misconfiguration. Okay. So post-exploitation, after an attacker has enrolled for a certificate, attackers will generally perform additional actions against the environment to gain further control over it, such as a DC sync. So a DC sync simulates the behavior of a domain controller to request all of the domain users' passwords but in NCLM hash format. So just to put simply, it's just a method to get all of the users' passwords. This grants the attacker the ability to impersonate any user, which they can then use to compromise any server or workstation and can monitor any user's actions, for example, web browsing, emails, and files. Generally, during an assessment, this is where we'd stop. We'd stop showing impact after we've either compromised the domain administrator or after we've performed a DC sync, as this shows sufficient control over the environment. Before we move on, just for context, I'd like to discuss two of the main authentication protocols supported by on-premises domains, these being NCLM Authentication and Kerberos. So NCLM uses the hash of the user's password to authenticate to network services using a challenge and response mechanism. Kerberos uses a ticketing system where the username of the user is encrypted with the password hash of the user, sent off to the domain controller to request tickets for various services. They then take these tickets and submit it to the services in order to authenticate to them. Both of these authentication material types are stored in memory on the computer the user is logged into, such as their workstation. So again, as stated previously, the whole attack will be demonstrated from the workstation. This demonstration doesn't take into account the effectiveness of antivirus or endpoint detection, but as previously stated, an attacker can execute the attack remotely to bypass these security controls. Also to note, an attacker would only need network access to the Active Directory Certificate Service server and to the domain controller in order to perform the attack. So the attack doesn't need to be performed from a domain joined host. Great, so a vulnerable template can be identified using the certify.exe tool. A certificate can then be requested using this identified vulnerable template to impersonate a privileged user. You can see the certificate's been saved to the desktop. We can then use the certificate to request either a Kerberos ticket or an NCLM hash of the administrator. And then we can use this Kerberos ticket or NCLM hash to perform a DC sync. So that's the NCLM hash. And those are the passwords for the users. Well, the hashes of the users. So sometimes tooling doesn't work straight off the bat. For example, we encountered a situation on a client's engagement where we had successfully enrolled for a certificate impersonating a domain administrator, but the domain controller wouldn't supply us back a Kerberos ticket, as you can see on screen. So initially we thought that perhaps the domain didn't support certificate-based authentication at all, but then we tried a little harder, we did a bit more research, and we discovered that there are two main authentication protocols supporting certificate-based authentication. This being PK and NIT, supported by the Kerberos service, as you can see on screen, and S-channel for authentication, supported by a number of other services. So it was evident that the Kerberos service didn't support PK and NIT, but we were still in possession of a valid certificate impersonating a domain administrator, so there must have been another service that would accept this authentication material. So after a bit more reading, we discovered that LDAP Secure accepts certificate-based authentication, so we authenticated directly to the domain controller using LDAP Secure. As you can see, we have successfully enrolled as a domain administrator at the bottom there. Great. So the next problem we encountered is that current offensive tooling didn't support certificate-based authentication directly because the majority of the domain services either supported Kerberos or NCLM authentication. So in an attempt to avoid writing our own custom tooling to exploit the domain through LDAP secure directly, we attempted to identify other avenues to obtain a privileged Kerberos ticket or NCLM hash. So again, it was back to the drawing board, and we theorized 3 potential attack vectors that could do this. The first being, we used our privileged access to LDAP to read the lab's local administrative passwords from computer accounts, and then we attempted to log into those computers using the lab's password. So when you request a password for a lab's computer account, it's done very similarly to how you can see on screen. But user access control was enabled, which prevented us from compromising the systems remotely. So UAC is a security control that requires the user to respond to a prompt when performing a task that requires elevated privileges. So for example, before deleting a sensitive file, please click OK. So when attempting to compromise the system using an elevated task, we couldn't respond to the prompt, and thus the task would not execute. The second method we tried was to conduct a constrained delegation attack. This one worked. So to perform the attack, we used our privileged access to LDAP to change the attributes of a compromised user account. We changed the attributes of the allowed to delegate to attributes, if you have a look on screen, to the LDAP service on that domain controller. A few other attributes were also changed, which were required for the attack, but effectively this allowed us to use the account to impersonate any user against LDAP on that domain controller. The difference here being that we knew the victim's NCLM hash, and we didn't just have their certificate. We're then able to use the offensive tool Rubius in a minute, and the victim's NCLM hash to request a domain administrator service ticket. You can see the service ticket loaded in memory over there. And then we use this service ticket to conduct a DC sync. So we've discussed post-exploitation. Now let's discuss persistence. It's one thing to have all the keys to a bank's vaults, but it's just as important to an attacker to keep them. So attackers will generally look for persistence vectors that will go unnoticed should a company be alerted to their presence and change all the keys. So the attacker would hopefully have one master key that will go unnoticed during this process, which they can then use to regain control of the environment. A new domain persistence vector was introduced with the research done by Spectre Ops, this being the compromise of a root certificate authority. So with a compromised root CA, an attacker would be able to forge certificates offline. And because they were forged offline, the Active Directory certificate service would have no knowledge of their creation and thus cannot revoke the certificate. An example of how to compromise a root CA is shown on screen. This is the built-in CA backup feature. The current IR processes we have encountered to perform a full domain takeback won't work, as they don't include full CA revocation. The ramifications of such a persistence vector is large, so all of the certificates that have been generated with that certificate authority will need to be reconfigured. So this is websites, APIs, VPNs, as an example. We will need to develop new IR processes, or at least extend or modify on what we have. So as an example, the processes would likely include some of the following. So step 1, after first expelling the attackers from the network, recover the public key infrastructure before performing a full domain takeback. New certificate chains will need to be configured before revoking the old chains, and chains will need to be switched from old to new before revoking the old chains. It will likely cost the company a significant amount of time to recover from a domain compromise. Also, another thought specifically for larger environments is how do you know if you've successfully removed an attacker's privileges? What if you miss an account? Or what if they migrated their privileges during the takeback? Or if they're using an alternative persistence vector at the time which was unknown, such as certificates? The best way to recover from a domain compromise is not to have one, not to say that we shouldn't also prepare for the scenario. So to conclude, the core issue is that new domain privilege escalation and persistence vectors have been identified in Active Directory certificate services. As a result, we'll need to revisit these services for misconfigurations. It'll be useful for the technical teams responsible for resolving the issues to work through Spectre Ops' white paper. They can also use the offensive and defensive toolkits on screen to identify any misconfigurations. Okay, moving on to the next attack. The NCLM Authentication protocol has been around since the 1990s. NCLM relays would likely have been discovered shortly after that, so that's 20 to 30 years of NCLM relay attacks. Weaknesses in the protocol allow the authentication material to be relayed onto other services if the other services do not enforce digital signing. So digital signing is a method of ensuring that the content of a message comes from the right entity. If this is not enforced, then the credentials material can be relayed onto other services for desired goals, such as to compromise the system remotely. So there's two main aspects associated with the attack. You have coercion and then you have relay. So coercion is methods to convince or trick a user or computer account to authenticate to a service under the attacker's control. The credential material is then relayed onto other services for a desired goal, such as extracting credentials from memory. So a relay attack can be thought of as an attacker asking John to send them a parcel. When they get the parcel, they put their own content into it, such as a bomb, and then they send this bomb off to server B, which is the victim. So when server B receives the parcel, because digital signing is not enforced, they can see that the packaging is from John, but they don't verify all of its content. So the bomb is allowed through. The bomb in this case is a metaphor for malware. There are numerous ways to coerce a server to authenticate. As an example, you can interact with remote procedure calls or the print spooler service. Some of these methods can be disabled and others have been patched, but you can't rule them out completely. Also to note, new ways of performing coercion will likely continue to be discovered in the future. So in order to exploit an NCLM relay attack, an attacker will generally look for three things. The first being a domain object with administrative rights over a computer account. That computer account will be the target of the attack. Number two, the host with administrative rights must have network access to port 445 on an attacker-controlled host so that the credentials can be relayed. And then number three, SMB signing must not be enforced on the target host. So SMB signing can be identified using port scanning tools such as Nmap. So there is a difference between enabling SMB signing and enforcing it. So if SMB signing is only enabled, the client gets to choose whether or not to use it, so the attacker. But if it's enforced, the attacker has no option, and thus the attack will be prevented. The last one is conditional. So if the attack is conducted from a compromised Windows host, the attacker will also require administrative rights to that host to disable SMB and to take control of port 445. Great. So an example of a target using this attack, prime example is SCCM for two main reasons. The first, that it's required by design to have administrative rights over a database server. And then number two, users with high privileges in the domain generally manage the database server. So if you compromise the server, you've got a high chance of obtaining privileged credentials. So in contrast to the ADCS attack, this attack is conducted remotely, simulating how an attacker would likely perform the attack. The purpose of the attack, as we discussed previously, is to use the SCCM server's administrative rights over the database server to extract credentials from memory. So step one, the attacker coerces the SCCM server to authenticate to SMB on the workstation. After the SCCM server authenticates to the workstation, the credential material is then relayed off to SMB on the database server. This will grant the attacker remote administrative control of the host. And then stage three is to use this privileged access to the database server to extract credentials from memory. Okay, so a few years ago, let's say 4 or 5 years, I used to conduct these attacks by performing DNS poisoning. This was done by exploiting broadcast services such as LMMR and NetBIOS. The basic idea of the attack being when a host on the network doesn't know the IP address of another host, it would broadcast it to the network. And when it broadcasts it to the network, we would respond by saying, that's my host, and this is my IP address, using tools such as Responder. This wasn't very reliable, as you sometimes had to wait the whole day in order to intercept the right set of credentials that would grant you access to something, and it also disrupted network traffic. Then new research was released, which showed how to interact with the Prince Spooler service on a remote host in order to coerce that server to authenticate to you. So this was great. We could start performing targeted attacks. We didn't need to wait the whole day, and we were no longer denying network traffic. So over the corresponding years, we then continued to inform our clients to enforce SMB signing until one of them decided rather just to disable the Prince Spooler service in order to mitigate some of the risks associated with the attack. But the attack was still possible. We just needed to find another avenue to coerce the server to authenticate to us. Another tool was then released. This tool is called Petit Patam, which showed how to interact with the remote procedure calls on that server to coerce it to authenticate. So this research was done at the same time as the assessment where the client had disabled the Prince Spooler service. So we continued with the attack, which we'll demonstrate for you now. Okay, so as stated previously, the attack is conducted remotely using Strike as the command and control server. The line at the top shows the information of the compromised hosts, this one being the workstation. So our port forward is executed on the workstation. This is to take control of port 445. A relay is then started on the attacker's host, which is then proxied through the workstation and targets the SCCM database server. A SOX proxy is then also started on the workstation. This is used to proxy the coercion attack. That's the command. And then the coercion attack is also run from the attacker's host using Petit Patam. So as you can see, the attack succeeded, and malware was deployed to the database server, granting us administrative access to it, as you can see there in CobbleStrike. So from this point, we ran logged on passwords, which extracted credentials from memory. We then used the domain administrator's password hash to perform a DC sync. It takes a bit of time. So there's more opportunity to detect NCLM Relay attacks in comparison to ADCS attacks. This can be done using network monitoring software, or it can be done using host-based sources such as AV or EDR when the attacker laterally moves onto those hosts. Other impacts of a domain compromise include the ability to conduct ransomware via group policy as an example. So if an account with the privileges to either create or edit group policy is compromised, the attacker can push ransomware to all of the domain joined hosts when they update their policy. So by default, servers and workstations update their policy every 90 minutes with 30 minutes of jitter, but we have seen some companies change this to 15 minutes. So to conclude, man-in-the-middle attacks are still prevalent and currently affecting our corporate networks. We need to protect network traffic from these types of attacks by enforcing digital signing. Vulnerability scanners can be used to identify if digital signing is not enforced. Okay, moving on to the last attack. We were in what appeared to be a hopeless situation on a client engagement, where we had no viable attack options we could conduct against that environment. We had one low privileged user, let's call him John, and John had RDP access to 5 hosts. So we prioritized our efforts on this host, and after a lot of searching, we found a file containing credentials. We then used this new set of credentials to cascade our credential shuffling attacks until we had full control over the domain. So credential shuffling is the repeated process of using a pool of credential material available to laterally move to other hosts and extract more credential material. We've seen a number of privilege rights granted to low privilege domain groups that have allowed credential shuffling attacks to succeed. In some instances, we have even seen where a low privilege group was granted ownership rights over the domain object. So this is full control over the domain. Access control lists are another way attackers can exploit privileges granted to low privilege groups to laterally move. Some of these ACLs are shown on the screen. So in general, there would be more opportunity to detect these malicious actions, as an attacker would need to laterally move to a number of hosts before they would have sufficient credential material to actually compromise an entire domain. So to summarize this one, in order to minimize the blast radius of user accounts, low privilege domain groups should be stripped of privileges. These privileges should be assigned to new groups, and then only the users that require those privileges be added to those new groups, this following the security principle of least privilege. For the technical teams, if they want to identify privilege rights granted to low privilege groups, the following Bloodhound cipher query can be used. So to summarize off the whole thing, there are actionable items we can implement to prevent these attacks. The first one is we'll need to revisit Active Directory certificate services for misconfigurations. Number two, ideally COBRA should be used in preference of NCLM, but where this is not possible, digital signing will need to be enforced. And then lastly, the security principle of least privilege should be followed. I think what I'd like everyone to take away from this presentation is that a domain compromise is likely to be financially damaging, difficult to recover from, and disruptive to business. The best way to recover from a domain compromise is not to have one. These attacks are still present and affecting our corporate networks, so let's fix them. Thank you very much, everyone.